Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. And I'm really pleased to welcome you to our panel this evening, where we will be discussing financing the agricultural transition. I'm Charlotte Weston. I am Head of Reporting at the Sustainable Markets Initiative, and I'm delighted to introduce you to our panel, where we've got representatives from a range of different industries. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in a moment, but first of all, I just wanted to say a couple of words about the Sustainable Markets Initiative, which has brought the panel together this evening. So, the Sustainable Markets Initiative, or the SMI, was started by His Majesty King Charles in 2020. It aims to accelerate the transition by bringing industry together and getting them to do more within their industries and across industries. And tonight's panel is an example of that and the work that the Agribusiness Task Force within the SMI have been doing. The SMI's got 20 task forces spanning all different industries, and the Agribusiness Task Force was one of the first of those 20. So, to start off this evening, I'm going to turn over to Grant Reed. Grant, if I can ask you to introduce yourself to the audience and maybe say a few words around the work that you've been doing with the Agribusiness Task Force and how important you think collaboration is in accelerating the transition.
Sure. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us late. So, I appreciate the commitment. My name is Grant Reed. Currently, chair the SMI Agri Task Force. Previously, I was CEO of Mars Incorporated. Um, so, I'll say it quickly, which is, this is a system issue that we have to fix. It's very complex, and it's going to take public, private, and philanthropy to make it happen. So, the level of collaboration, it has to be uncommon collaboration. It has to be something very special. And that's why, even from the group that's in front of you today, you see it's a very mixed group that you wouldn't normally see necessarily in an agricultural discussion. And we can get into what we're doing, why it works. But the mission is to triple the level of regenerative agriculture by 2030, which is 5 harvests away. So we've got a lot to do in the time available. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Grant. Now I'll move on to Charlie. Charlie, if I can ask you to introduce yourself. And maybe if you could share some of the work that you've been doing within your business on regenerative agriculture, and perhaps a few words on the banking sector more broadly as well.
Great, thanks. So I'm the banker in the room, so apologies for that in advance. And also, again, thank you for coming. We much of a conversation we can have, the better, I think. I'm the CEO of Lloyds Banking Group in the UK, so we're the largest retail and commercial bank in the UK. We're a big business, but we're also the biggest business or bank for farmers and for agriculture in the UK. We have relationships with about half the farmers in the UK, and we lend about 35%, 34% to farmers. Um, as we know, agriculture represents a material part of climate emissions, but biodiversity, water, and nutrient neutrality issues in the UK. And for my financed emissions, it's actually 37% of my financed emissions. So it only represents 34 billion of my 900 billion pounds of assets. So a low percentage of my assets, but it represents 37% of my financed emissions. So we're completely committed to working with farmers and with the government to try and help the transition to work. I won't go through all the solutions, but the starting point for us is the farmers have to be at the heart of this. And this is about us working out how we can support finance, make it cheaper and easier for them to transition to more regenerative agricultural processes and practices, and also work with our government to try and make sure the incentives are aligned and create new income streams for farmers, which I'm sure we'll talk about later.
Fantastic, thank you. Patrick, would you mind introducing yourself and maybe saying a few words around the roles of NGOs and philanthropic organizations in accelerating the transition?
Yes, I'm Patrick Holden. I'm lead one of the SMI task forces on measuring land use sustainability, the global farm metric. I'm also chief executive of the Sustainable Food Trust, whose mission is to work internationally to accelerate the transition towards more sustainable food systems. And I'm one of the NGOs on the SMI, which I think has been a really good thing, because I think as has been said repeatedly here at COP, we need new alliances between the business sector and the NGO sector, and this is a manifestation of one of them. I'm also a farmer in my own right, and because I was at a meeting about 8 years ago with a group of farmers who started comparing their sustainability audits, I was responsible for developing the Soil Association organic standards many years ago. And then there are other audits in the UK, like there's the Red Tractor audit, which is a kind of baseline audit, and then there's LEAF, and there's all sorts of others. And we started comparing our auditing stories, and we all agreed that none of them told us what we really wanted to know, which was the impact of our farming activities on the balance sheet of nature, as the King has referred to it. And I mean by the balance sheet of nature, the carbon, in other words, the climate impact, but also the biodiversity and the social impact of my farming activity. And as it happens, I've been farming 50 years, during which time I've been farming in a sort of regenerative and organic way, but I cannot tell you what the impact has been because I haven't been recording the data. So that was what instigated us to think we need to develop a globally harmonized framework for measuring land use sustainability. Fast forward those 8 years, we're making some progress. And I would say that the potential of this amazing stakeholder partnership, which is a cross-stakeholder SMI initiative, which is making a bit of history, is to bring all these huge players together to work out what the impact of farming systems is on those three categories in a way that people can trust, and maybe even link it to market products. And just to declare my problems, and this is a handover to our next speaker. If you look at the carbon on my farm, it looks as if even though we're a livestock farm, we may be carbon negative, but I want to know. That's why we're doing this stuff. Um, the Achilles heel of our farming system is the energy. So we need to do a lot more to make ourselves more renewable energy self-sufficient. We're not there at the moment.
Fantastic. Thank you, Patrick. There are a couple of really interesting points there around metrics, which we'll come back to in a moment. But Greg, delighted to welcome you. If you could possibly introduce yourself to the audience and say a few words around what regenerative agriculture means to you in your business and your sector.
Well, first of all, I'm Greg Jackson. I'm the founder of Octopus Energy. We're a sustainable energy company, just become the biggest power company in the UK, but operate around the world. And really, our mission is how do we create a truly sustainable energy system, recognizing that in a renewable world, it's not a like-for-like replacement for fossil fuels. It's not about whatever industry you're currently in, just changing the power source. It fundamentally changes your industry. And farming, I mean, as you said, like in your sustainable farm, energy is your number one carbon problem. And we all grew up in a world in which energy was delivered by miners and drillers. But increasingly, energy is being delivered by farmers, wind farmers, solar farmers, biomass farmers. We biomass plants. I think the interesting thing then is that your farm shouldn't be delivering carbon because it's using energy. It should be delivering energy, clean energy. You should be the first customer of it. You'll never get cheaper power than that. And the rest of it, you should be selling. Right. When you were talking about diversifying income streams, being able to sell the surplus energy after you've run your farm on clean energy has got to be one of the simplest ways of both helping the economics and the carbon.
Thank you, Greg. Last but not least, Michael, I think we're all hoping that we'll come out of this call with real action, and we're delighted to welcome you to the panel as somebody who's really at the forefront of driving the action around this. So could you introduce yourself to the audience and say a little bit about what you're doing and the farm that you're running?
I'm Michael Taylor. I'm a livestock producer and agroforester from the east coast of Australia. We're a small to medium sized farm. We're not a large farm. We're a family farm. I'm sixth generation. We've had we had a massive change on our farm probably 40 years ago. We lost a lot of the tree cover between the 1940s, 50s, and the mid 80s, and the whole region, the New England region, lost over 20% of tree cover, down to less than 5% tree cover across the region. So we were getting the full brunt of that through the 80s drought when we had dust storms and loss of soil and ground cover and losing stock. So we started changing things. And over the last 40 years, we've managed to get up to back over 23% tree cover. But it's been a huge effort. I'm very fortunate that my parents have been quite innovative and we've found ways to do things cheaply. Generally, farmers when they're faced with a challenge like that, are very good at finding solutions. But it's not as easy for everybody. In Australia, we operate in a very competitive environment, and finance is the same for all businesses. So, yeah, look, I just cannot believe this is my first COP. I cannot believe that there's not more farmers here. I can't believe hasn't been more farmers here the last how many years has COP been going. But it's good to see that there is a recognition now. But if it wasn't for the MacDoc Foundation, I wouldn't be here, being able to tell our story to everybody, along with a lot of the other farmers here that are able to also tell their farmers stories about how they've transitioned to a regenerative operation. But okay. Don't know where to go from here. But I'm incredibly overwhelmed, and I do have some good news. And we are one of the original farms in the Farming for the Future project, which is currently the largest natural capital modelling project in the world. They're up to about 130 farms, but they're aiming for 1,200 farms. But that's going to take a huge amount of investment to get that modelling up to speed. But for the first time, we know that over the last 40 years, we're now, on average, over the last 10 years, we've been sequestering over 200 tonnes of CO2 from our property, and that's at profitable and full production. So it's finding the balance. It's for the first time we've been able to see that the balance between conservation and production is achievable, even in a regenerative, whatever you want to call it, because that word is a very new word for something that we've been doing for a lot longer. And this is a story. I've just come out of another session. This is a story that is common across all continents in the world. So we're not alone.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's brilliant that you're here and wonderful to hear your perspectives. Grant, I wonder if you wouldn't mind bringing to life a little bit more the work of the Agribusiness Task Force and some of the projects that you've been working on and that you're planning on working on post-COP.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with why agriculture, why is it important, and why do we need to bring this group together? So the quick stats are it's 30% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, it's 50% of the world's habitable land, and the poorest people, the poorest 3/4 of people in the world are linked to farms, and they're the most vulnerable. So for all of those reasons, it's not just environment, climate, it's social, and in many cases, life itself. So that's the top line why it's important. There's only about 15% of the world using regenerative agriculture techniques, and that's a good point, Michael, on how do you define, regenerative? And the one I like is from Perry, who was head of the indigenous tribes in Canada, and he talks about the Scapios in Cree is about working with the soil and helping each other. And for many years now, we've been using predominantly an extraction or an extractive model, and it's depleting the soil. And when you deplete the soil, you have all the disadvantages of that: water retention, you're not capturing as much carbon, etc. So the whole purpose is to drive action, really trying to understand what the issue is, and Michael again and Patrick as a farmer who's been fantastic on the task forces. Farmers at the centre. All of what we've done, we've talked to farmers all over the world. They love their farms, they want to do the right thing. The system is stacked against them. The monetary system stacked against them, the governmental system stacked against them. And the way that I was procurement manager for Mars Worldwide, and I was stacked against them because we bought commodities and we bought commodities at lowest price. That model has to change. So what we're in the process of doing is demonstrating with a multi-industry group around the world there can be a different model. We measure it properly. We put the remuneration systems for the farm through the metrics for environmental benefit. We can make a change. And I'll pause there and pass the mic.
Thank you, Grant. you've mentioned metrics there, and Charlie, Patrick, you also mentioned metrics. So I wonder, perhaps if I come to Patrick first and then to you, Charlie, um, I'd love to hear from you your thoughts around how important you think having common metrics and measurement standards are, and secondly, how achievable you feel that is.
Think there are a lot of people all over the world who doubt that COP and the business community in particular at COP are going to really deliver the changes that are needed in the time available. And the word greenwash is out there, and there are people I've spoken to here who just think this is all just greenwash. And I'm doing a posting. I did one yesterday, and I basically said I'm right in the belly of the beast, talking to all these CEOs, and I think they're good people who are well intentioned, who want to be part of the change, don't always know what to do, but they want to work together because they've got children, and they care about the future of the planet. And I have to say that my experience of working in the SMI has been incredible in that regard. But I think that to sort out the accusations of greenwash, we must have a globally harmonized and trusted framework for measuring land use sustainability impacts. And it needs to be completely transparent and bear the toughest scrutiny. And that the reason I'm here really is because I believe in that deeply. I've farmed all my life. I care about my farm being part of the solution, not being part of the problem. It isn't entirely there yet. But I think if we work together in this collaborative way, there's no limit to what we can achieve. And it's incumbent upon us now to collaborate in the way that we are in the SMI. And I think it's a brilliant thing. So harmonization, critical, transparency, critical, accurate measurement, all these things need to come together, and they need to be behind this financing the agricultural pilot that we are co-creating, which will reward farmers who deliver on carbon, nature, and social impacts through an audit, and they'll get extra income from that.
I think from that, the beast. Is that right?
Nice beast.
So I have two views on the data, and I agree with everything you just said, Patrick. We can't let perfection get in the way of progress, though. So we also need to just start taking action and supporting farmers. So one of the things we're trying to do with farmers in the UK, and Patrick's leading us on this, and I've started by starting to fund 1,000 farmers and trying to collect a baseline of data, is to say what is the basic data that we could source, use it to help provide clarity on what practices and what technologies and what interventions would make a difference for those outcomes. Really simple. And then ideally is this idea of a third income stream. So most farmers obviously sell their food. In many countries, they get a subsidy from their governments. It's changing, but they need a third source of income, and they need it because they're either going to have to invest and or they may have a period of lower income as they move towards more regenerative practices. And I loved actually where you went, Greg. So one of those may be energy, but we definitely know there's a need for more carbon offsets, biodiversity, and interestingly, in the UK, there's two other potential sources of income which we're thinking about. One is nutrient neutrality. House builders are prevented from building houses based on nutrient imbalance, and the farmers are the solution for that. And then water retention and flood defenses. Interestingly, a lot of the water companies will pay farmers to manage water in a more progressive and sustainable way. So we're trying to agree a limited set of data and a limited set of metrics, and then let's start proving if we can get additional money in the farmers' hands and really prove that we can create that third source of income.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Michael, I'd love to pass the mic to you now and just hear a bit about your experience around metrics and measurement, and also picking up on a point that Patrick made around co-designing some of these solutions with farmers, potentially with policymakers as well. I'd love to hear your views on both the metrics and measurement in your experience, but also your experience with having these solutions co-designed with you as part of the group.
Yeah, well, you'll be pleased to know that one of our big four banks has actually committed money also to the Farming for the Future project. But it's a drop in the ocean. And as you know, nature is complex. Fortunately, the Farming for the Future project is using tried and tested ecosystem indicators that are recognised worldwide. So there's no inventing a new metric. It's all there. So, and they've also done a lot of work on bringing the cost of that down. So the modelling that they've developed will eventually, hopefully, allow they're up to about 70% accuracy, I believe, will eventually allow a desktop audit to be done. But there is a lot more investment required. And as I said, they're only up to 130 farms. And they really need those 1,200 odd farms across the country. So I'm happy to hear that there's 1,000 farms you're looking at, but there's already a model out there and it's already ahead of anything else that developed. So I'd love you to see it. Look, measuring what we've done on farm. We had the first carbon audit done on some of our trees back in 1992. So there's stuff that's been going on for a long time on a lot of farms. Back then, the internet didn't exist, and carbon certainly wasn't considered, ever going to be a commodity. But they were already looking at it in terms of an ecosystem health thing. But yeah, it's complex. So, but we're going to need more investment, and we're looking around now. So here we go.
Fantastic, thank you. Another point that you've mentioned through the discussion is the importance of the regulatory environment and policy. So, Greg, I wondered if we could pass the mic to you, and would love any of your thoughts on how important you think the policy and regulatory environment is in enabling this transition, but also enabling business to accelerate the transition.
Yeah, and I think I can speak to two specific areas within energy. Some examples. So I spoke earlier about energy is a good example of something where you can go from being a cost and a carbon problem to a revenue stream and a carbon solution. And you need two regulatory backdrops to allow that. One is you need planning and permitting. You actually have to be able to build this infrastructure. And I think it's incredibly important to stand up for farmers. You see in many wealthy nations, governments questioning whether or not you'll build wind turbines and solar panels on land. And it's kind of mad to me that, if a farmer wants to build these things, they might not be allowed to. And yet there are quite a lot of economies where that's a problem. And the second is you need to be paid for what you put onto the grid, right? And, there are huge swathes of many developed nations where you don't get paid for it. Like you generate your own, and any spare, that's lost. And so I think we need to make sure farmers get the revenue stream. Yeah, right. Which is mad. And so I think, taking that to a couple of examples, there's a project we've got in the UK called plots per kilowatts, where we identify local populations that want cheap energy and areas where there's enough infrastructure to be able to take the spare power from a farm and sell it back into the grid. And plots for kilowatts is where we ask farmers to say if they're interested in working together with us to generate on their land. We've had over 1,000 farmers have joined plots for kilowatts, ready for us to be able to build infrastructure to serve their local community and themselves. And I think the interesting thing about a scheme like that is it also helps deal with the finance issue. It's a lot easier for us to finance generation than it is for many farmers because we do it by the terawatt. And so I think you can start to unlock the revenue streams, capital, and the carbon benefit.
Yep, Patrick.
Just being like the case study, I mean, it's interesting. So we haven't got a grid connections, so we're only single phase. We've maxed out on what we can export. We've just had a quote literally 2 hours ago from a guy, as we're with Octopus now. Yeah, sorry, but I mean, it's interesting that I think the quote's 100,000, and we're heavily borrowed already. So this is a live thing going on on our farm right now. It's very, very interesting. Greg wasn't originally going to be in this conversation. I'm so glad he's part of it because I just was thinking the last few days, well, energy is a key part of this transition. So I don't know what you can do to help me, Greg.
I mean, look, I don't want to sell farmers solutions right now. These won't come from us, but it's a great example. One of the big energy uses, for example, a lot of farms in dairy is chillers. Now you can use smart technologies to use the electricity from the chiller, or use electricity to cool the chiller when it's cheapest. Oh, and that's often not aligned with your existing milking schedules. But by getting the timing right, you can halve the cost of electricity, quarter the cost of electricity. Similarly, electrifying vehicles, if you just start getting electric machinery on the farm and plug it in, you'll pay 4 times as much for the electricity as if it's smartly managed.
We've got an electric JCB. We're paying that now.
Okay? And so this ability really to optimize everything can dramatically cut the costs, and able to use your own production, carbon.
Great, thank you. I'm mindful of everyone's time, and I want to get some questions from the audience. So I'm going to come to you, Grant, and then I might just do a quick question to everyone before we turn over to the audience. Grant, it's fantastic to see the different industries that you've convened in the agribusiness task force, and also the diverse industries you've got represented here on the panel this evening. Thinking about who you've got here and also who you've actually got in the task force, are there any other voices or industries that you think are really critical or should be involved to really accelerate the transition?
Yeah, there's a lot of because you can't get a room full of 2,000 people around. It's just not possible or practical. So what we try and do is the people we bring in have incredible contacts. So if you take Patrick, his network is amazing in the farming world. So we're trying to listen to those voices, tapping into people who are expert in this space, like Adele, who's sitting in the audience, and others. So because I'll declare I'm not a regenerative farmer. When I was asked to do this, I couldn't even define regenerative farming. You may think from my first statement earlier today, I still can't. That's okay. Um, my job is to get things done, and so we need more government to be really lining up the resources, the training, the compensation schemes based on environmental outcomes. We need more companies because right now, I mean, this isn't just talking about what we're going to do. We've got almost 5 million acres already underway with companies like Pepsi, Mondelez, Indigo, etc., McCain. The first wave was companies on their own. The second wave is companies partnering. It's the third wave, which is really going to break us free, which is having insurance companies, bankers, asset managers, governments, partners working together to get it done. That's the mission.
Fantastic. Thank you, Grant. So just as a quick final question to all of the panel, I'd love to ask all of you, I'll start with Charlie and then we'll go along and end with Grant. Um, Thinking about your time at COP so far and specifically around regenerative agriculture, what would you say is your key takeaway for an action for the coming year around accelerating the transition for regenerative agriculture?
Look, I thought actually Michael said it really, really brilliantly that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Many of the solutions are there. We need to get on and do it. And what I've found in the last few days is the coalition of the willing is here, but we need to now focus and take action. So that's the focus for me.
Yes, let's create the enabling mechanisms, because I doubt there's a farmer in the world who wouldn't want to transition if they knew the transition could be financially viable and enrich the quality of their life, which it would do. So we need to create the conditions where this transition can happen, and that's our part of, not just us, but we're holding quite a lot of responsibility for helping that along.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a really important focus on the just transition. And that means thinking about farmers as farmers in every type of economy. And actually, I think we've got to be thinking about how we use the transition as an opportunity to keep on providing the citizens of the world with the sort of food and other agricultural products they need, not just in rich countries. We really think hard now about developing nations too. And I think the technologies and ideas we talk today make a difference everywhere.
Capacity building in the community. I think there's been so much money poured into on-ground works over the years and with no results. So I think the big part missing is the capacity building. If you give the ownership back to the farmers, and as you've said, if they knew that they could actually improve their profitability by improving their ecological health, they would readily invest. But you've got to hand that capacity back to farmers through education, extension, mentoring. So that's the only way I think that you will see a future and passing on, for future generations. Otherwise, it's a waste of money. So
Well said. Well said, Michael. And I think my first COP was Glasgow because it was in Scotland, so that may have been influenced me. And agriculture really wasn't discussed. I went to some very high level meetings and tried to talk about agricultural transition, and people just glazed over. So the fact that we're talking about it's great to have Greg here. I mean, he's got his experience of the energy transition, and so what would I love to see? The magic happens when strategies intersect, and we just heard strategic intersections all around the room here, where people who are trying to build their businesses, trying to build their livelihoods, whether it's an NGO, a farm, bank, or a consumer company, when the strategies intersect, the magic happens and stuff gets done. And I'm really feeling like some of those strategies are starting to intersect, and it's a lot to do, but I'm hopeful.
Thank you. Thank you all. And a big thank you to the panel for all of your contributions this evening. We have got time for a few questions, so I'll turn over to the audience.
Thank you. Glasgow was my first COP as well for similar reasons, because if I couldn't find accommodation, I could kip on my friend's sofa. So I met Patrick for the first time today with Secam and Helmi. I work for a company called ICE. It owns the New York Stock Exchange. It's the biggest energy and environmental marketplace in the world. We also price coffee and cocoa, so a nexus to Mars. Like electricity generation is the thing about the tools existing, they kind of exist in that we know how to price externalities. So the UK has done a pretty good job in decarbonizing electricity because polluters pay, and you reward people who generate sustainable regenerative electricity, right? Through a REGO, you get paid extra for it. Economy of love credits with Secam in Egypt. So there are products available that help to price externalities. The problem is that outside of government mandates, polluters don't tend to pay. So my question is, how do we, like, SEA is basically a climate club for aviation sector. They're not mandated to do it, but they've got together and they're going to say we're going to pay for some of our emissions. So how can we get like the agricultural industry to form like a climate club to pay for some of their emissions? Because then you can start transferring the wealth. And the point around global south as well, a lot of these carbon savings, they're in Africa, right? So coffee and cocoa is produced in Africa and the savings available in Africa. And so you can transfer the wealth there as well. So someone needs to sort of take a bit of a risk and start paying for some. How does that happen?
I would really like to hear from my other industry leaders about this, because what strikes me is that we can do a lot in rewarding positive externalities. But until we make sure that those who are causing damage are financially responsible for the negative impacts, we're up against what you might call aeronautically a headwind of uncosted negative externalities. And the reason why governments don't want to act in this is because if they make the polluter pay in agriculture, the price of food will go up, and that's politically unattractive. So I would love to hear from my co-panelists how we can break this, because in these COP negotiations, they really ought to be making sure that in agriculture, the polluter should pay. I mean, why wouldn't we do that? So why isn't it happening here? How can we make it happen? How can we break that?
So it is one of the core questions, and I was simplistically talking about the third income stream, but I think we need to break it down into two ways of thinking about it. First, as Grant talked about, having some of the biggest food buyers on the planet involved in this is really important, because what we're seeing is are starting to understand what premium they would pay for food with certain either biodiversity or carbon credentials. And there are some good pilots. And I was just learning about Egypt. In the US, there's some examples, and we know now the premium for certain crops that certain types of large food buyers are willing to pay for. And you mentioned McCain and McDonald's, obviously your old organization. We're starting to put a price on the premium, and it potentially, I don't think it's mature enough yet. There's a separate price for carbon versus biodiversity for those that want natural capital or biodiversity credits versus, as I said, potentially nutrient and or water outcomes. That's the first thing, and that's a real market price. You'll understand this for the commodities businesses like Cargill's. There's an interesting tension around: is that price something that the commodities traders capture, or is it something that gets to the farmers? So there is a really interesting and important debate to be had on that. The second thing is for those people, and Lloyd's Banking Group is a good example. I have 100,000 people, 9.2 billion cost base. I can find a way to offsetting 90% of my carbon by 2030, but there's 10% I can't get to, and I'm going to have to buy carbon offsets and carbon credits, and it's very hard to find credible carbon offsets. And there are some other organizations looking at that from biodiversity and other broader outcomes as well. And so can we create people an income stream linked to credits, but credits that have real auditability and credibility, and that have, I think, Patrick, ultimately some kind of government framework to really make them relevant. So two totally different sources of income, both need to be developed. The magic, we think, is get the same source of data, same practices, deriving those outcomes, and then you and I can go and monetize them.
Ron, did you want to add that?
If there's other questions,
Yeah. Is there any other? Yeah, great. I'll bring it over.
Thank you. Thank you for discussion today. I'm from Ukraine. We start with regenerative agricultural project, and situation around Ukraine, and that Ukraine is one of the biggest flow to the European Union and to UK, especially with commodities. And regenerative agriculture in the frame of the carbon projects, it's a very interesting approach now, because through carbon you can allocate money for the farmers and to put flow directly to them. Because why this thought? Because you cannot measure somehow the biodiversity. It's one of the question to you, how to measure biodiversity in a frame that it would be reliable, it would be recognized, and actually the projects what you are looking for, offset projects with a biodiversity big part of the project, how to measure, how to prove, what is the role of the water in all the story, and how to start to propose to the market to pay also for the water, not just for the carbon. Because I believe that the main driver for all scaling up and changes is the farmers, because they are going to do their own job daily on the fields, and but not we are so much in our rooms, in our offices, but farmers, and they have to get the fair price for that. And we should think how to allocate money for them and how to bring that. But from another side, to keep all the interests together, and to ensure that the companies who is going to buy assets with biodiversity, they are covered also, because the reputation risks and all that criticism what is around. So probably it was a comment, but the clear question to you, maybe you have already some kind of tools or suggestions what to do with the biodiversity in this case, in a big scale, not just for the small farmers. Thank you.
Other people may want to comment, but I think you raised some critical questions, because if the global farm metric or their equivalent schemes, including the soil association exchange schemes, are going to be trusted, we have to be able to measure in a farmer-friendly way, but in the same way which is robust enough to be an accurate reflection of the biodiversity or the water quality or whatever it is. So I think, just a quick comment about the biodiversity. There's a lot of biodiversity measuring going on in the world right now, and biodiversity credits and all that kind of thing, biodiversity net gain. But very few of the people involved with this discussion are actually thinking about the biodiversity which used to coexist with food production in the fields. I'm old enough to remember that in the 50s. and has gone during my farming lifetime. So everybody's concentrated on the margins and the forests and the strips around the edges. Nobody's thinking about the battleground, which is what it's been, where biodiversity has disappeared from the fields. So we need to have AI, maybe photographing quadrats in fields which are geolocated and using plant identification. We need to choose proxy species. We need to work out which the species are in the plant kingdom, the insect kingdom, etc., bird kingdoms, and then get an algorithm which converts that into a biodiversity score in the fields. So that's work in progress. And that's the sort of thing that we have to grapple with, because we have to be able to deliver on this. And if it's going to monetize it, it's got to be accurate. Same with water. I think water is a bit easier, but I won't spend any more time answering your question, but I think the short answer is there's people working on this, and we need to harmonize the work that, and also what's already known, and come up with the most intelligent and farmer friendly ways in which they can measure their own biodiversity and therefore be eligible for payments.
Yeah, just one quick add, and the new report will be coming out, I think, 8th of December. So from the subcommittee, which is to all the 200 metrics out there that are already there, which said, look, what's the easiest, most credible? We distilled it down to 15, then we distilled it down to 5 that we're going to try and use as measurement. Is it perfect? No. Does it compass everything? No. But to Charlie's point, it's more than sufficient to make great progress, and then we'll refine over time. So all the metrics are in there and define how we're going to measure it.
And as I mentioned before, farming for the future is well on the way. There's, like I said, there is a huge amount of data. La Trobe University have been involved in the last increment of that project, and we literally had ecologists crawling over our property, measuring all these things, and ground truthing that with all the aerial imagery and remote imaging that's already available. So there's companies like Downforce, originally from the UK, that are developing some of this remote sensing technology too, and the accuracy is improving all the time. So it's quite mind blowing actually what's already out there that just hasn't been made available yet at a reasonable cost for this sort of measurement. But yeah.
Thank you. As we're at time, I'd just like to do another great big thanks to our panel for all of your contributions this evening. It's been a really wide-ranging but positive and action-focused discussion. I'm delighted that we ended with the final words from our farmer on the panel. So thank you to the panel. Thank you to the audience. If anybody is interested in finding more about the Agribusiness Task Force, please do get in touch with us. We'd be delighted to tell you more about it. And thank you again.